Welcome back everyone to session 8 and 9 of a lecture on international political economy. Today we will have to discuss two sessions at once because I was sick last week. However, this will work out just fine because the two topics of these two sessions, labor and gender, have a lot to do with one another, so it's easy to combine them into one session, even though there would be way more to say about each of them, but I'll reduce the content a little bit to fit it all in one session. And once again, I promise that I try to be more concise from now on. We'll see in half an hour or an hour whether I can live up to this promise. The structure of today's session will be as follows. First, I'll discuss the division of labor, social domination and externalization in a more general sense. Then I'll specifically speak to the gender division of labor and the women's movement. Then I'll discuss Foxconn as one example for assessing the international division of labor. And finally, I'll introduce you to the ILO's decent work agenda. So let's begin with the division of labor, social domination and externalization. I showed you this diagram in the last two sessions already, and in the last two sessions we focused on one of the three factors, which is capital. Today we'll progress to the next factor, which is labor. And when we think about labor in IPE and in the economy in general, at least in a mainstream perspective, we typically implicitly only think about wage labor. So we don't think about any kind of work that anyone performs. So if you want a very, very general idea of work, then you probably only think about putting time and effort into something. However, if we think about wage labor, you only refer to a specific form of work, which means you put in time and effort for something while you're working for someone else and get paid by them. So you're hopefully putting time and effort into your studies here. So it's work, I'd say, but it's probably not wage labor because no one pays you for it in the sense that they then own the results of your study. In the best case, maybe someone pays you for it in the sense of a stipend or scholarship or something like that, or an allowance by your parents or whomever. However, it's not a wage that you get for the stuff that you create or produce or the services that you perform during your studies, which does not mean that it's not hard work for you. I, on the other hand, I also put in time and effort here, and I get paid for this time and effort. So what I do here is wage labor. What you do is probably not wage labor, which does not mean that what I do is any more important or relevant or worth anything more than what you do. It's just a different kind of human activity that I perform. And you can think about many other kinds of work processes where people invest time and effort into things and don't do this as wage labor. This could be because they are self-employed. It could also be because it's something that you just don't get money for, like some kind of volunteering, but I'm not going to go into this. So mostly we think about wage labor. However, this is quite tricky because it makes other kinds of work invisible, as I will discuss later on today. So when we talk about wage labor, what do we need for capitalism to work here? So again, the general idea of capitalism is that we have investors that hold a lot of money or capital, and they invest this capital into a certain production facility maybe, and then they employ others to work in this facility, and then the ones that are the investors own the products and can then sell these products. And then you need capital and money, all that, but you also need those workers for capitalism to work. So to have workers, what do you need? First of all, you need a lot of people. And typically this is by far the majority of the population that acts as workers in an economy. So first of all, for capitalism to work, you need people. So without people, there will be no capitalism. Secondly, you need people that must be educated and cared for. So it's probably not enough for these people to simply exist as biological Homo sapiens. You also need them to have the capacities to work and to perform the kind of labor that there is demand for in the market. And the further capitalism progresses, the more and more this means that we need an educated labor force also. But it's not only education, it's also that they need to be cared for, particularly as children. They cannot exist by themselves, so they need someone who gives them the attention and the stuff that they need. And this all, of course, also is work, and this is care work, and I'm going to discuss this later, but that's something that you need in order to have workers who can then work. However, if we have the best educated and cared for people out there, it still doesn't mean that we can have all the conditions for capitalism, because in order for them to become employees or workers in capitalism, it's probably also important that they don't have any better opportunities there. Because typically work or wage labor is not the most attractive kind of human activity that's out there. Some jobs might be attractive, but in general there are a lot of jobs that must be done that are not very attractive. And if all the people out there have a better alternative than that, then they probably not do it. So then employers, they might have capital to build a factory, but they don't find anyone to work in there. So because everyone has more attractive stuff to do, so for capitalism it's important that not everyone has better alternatives, and this particularly means that they don't have better alternatives to gain their income. So we already discussed this when we discussed the emergence of capitalism in England. Most of the people in England were farmers, and many of these farmers would have preferred to remain farmers rather than to go into the factory and work 15, 16 hours a day there. Who wouldn't? So they had to be driven from their lands in order for them to become available on the labor market. And this is of course a very drastic form where all better alternatives are destroyed by violence in the last instance. But there are also other forms. For example, in China right now we also see processes where people from farming villages migrate to cities to work as industrial workers there. And this does not happen because someone takes their land. It happens because they act under the assumption that they're gonna have a better life when they move to the city and work as a factory worker, that they have higher income, and so on and so on. And there's a lot more to these processes, but it's not always by force. And this condition also means that when people discuss about such a thing as a universal basic income, which some people of the left oftentimes do, this of course means that either this universal basic income must be so low that people still have an incentive to engage in wage labor, or it will make the existence of capitalism a little bit more difficult, to say the very least. So if everyone has an income that is sufficient to provide for a good life for them, then they're probably still gonna do stuff. They're not just gonna lay around and watch Netflix. They're probably still gonna do stuff, but it's questionable whether they're gonna engage in wage labor that much, and then there might be a problem there. I'm not going to go into this right now. Rather, I'm going to discuss the last of these conditions here, that these people also have to at least acquiesce to capitalism. So it means even if we have enough people and they are sufficiently educated and cared for, and they don't have any better alternatives, in order for capitalism to exist, you additionally also need these people to be willing to put up with capitalism. So this basically means they should better not be all communist revolutionaries, because then capitalism also has a problem. But all in all over the world, most of these conditions apply right now. So we have to think, why is it that these conditions apply, and what does it mean? If we once again look at the whole question from the other perspective, so we don't look at it from the perspective of capitalism and ask, what does capitalism need in order to work fine? We can also ask the other way around and say, well, under which conditions would we say that capitalism is a thing that we find maybe the best among bad alternatives, or maybe even a good thing? And this is also a good point to look at the situation of those who are dependent on wage, because this is almost by definition a majority of the population. At least these are much more people than people that can live on capital. Very roughly speaking, in capitalism, you can always say there are two different groups of people: those that are dependent for the living on capital income, which means they at some point in their life have enough money that they invest somewhere, and then they benefit from the profits of this investment. Or on the other hand, you don't have sufficient funds to do that, or you don't do that for whatever reason, then you have to provide for your income by earning wages. There are also some other possibilities, like small businesses or so, but in general it are those two alternatives. And for capitalism to work, it will always be that there will be way more people to depend on wages. So their living condition is, of course, what's defining for how good capitalism is for human beings living under capitalism. So we should look at that. We should look at it. So what exactly to look at? I just listed a couple of questions here. You can also put some of them together or differentiate them further. But let's just start here. So first you can ask, how are the workplace conditions? So if you look at the places where people perform their jobs, how are the conditions there? Are they safe? Do they injure themselves every half an hour? Is there enough good air to breathe? Are they just forced to be in very small, very unpleasant spaces together? Is it very loud? Is it not very loud? And so on and so on. So how is the workplace conditions? How is workplace safety? Secondly, we can of course ask, what wages do they earn? Here we can on the one hand ask, do they earn a living wage? So does the money that they earn suffice for them to pay for their basic needs? And then we can of course ask, what are basic needs? Is it only food and clothing, or is it also a PlayStation, or is it also good wine, or is it also a holiday once a year? So this is culturally variable. However, we can ask this question, is it enough that they earn? And then we can also ask, in another fashion, we can ask, okay, what is the share of the wages? We can say, okay, if in a certain company there is such and such amount of value added, so they get in raw materials for, let's say, 50 million euros, and then they produce stuff from that are worth 100 million euros, then the value added in this factory is roughly another 50 million euros. And then we can see, okay, how much of these 50 million euros goes to the people who work there, and how much of it goes to the people who invested the capital. And then we can see what the share of each of this is. And in general, we can say that typically, right now, at least in developed countries, a majority in most cases goes to the people that work there, but the share of it's changing, and over the last 50 years, so since the 1970s, the share of the profits is rising, is increasing, the share of the wages is decreasing, so productivity is increasing, but the wages are not increasing as much as productivity does increase as a general tendency, but it varies a lot from country to country. And then, of course, it's not only the relationship between what amount the wages are and what amount the capital income is. You can also ask, okay, which groups earn what amount of money there? How is the relation between those that work in the blue-collar jobs in relation to those that work in the white-collar jobs, so in offices? And there are a lot of many more questions that you can ask, and you can also ask, and I'll explain this more later, how this comes to gender and so on and so on. But one question that we have to ask is how much money do people earn? Next question, of course, how many hours do they have to work per day, per week, per month, per year, and so on? How much holiday do they have? Do they have free weekends? And who determines when they have to work and how much do they have to work when? Can the company just say, well, right now there's just not much work at the factory, so please stay at home, you don't get any money? Or is this a fixed amount of hours that they work per week, and if there's no work, then it's the company's problem, not the workers' problem? So where are the risks here? All these are the questions that we can ask here. Next one is, how secure and precarious is the job? So is there a hire and fire type of economy, or is there an economy where workers can rely on their job even in an economic crisis? And this is, once again, I already mentioned this a couple of times, one of the differences that we see between the continental European labor markets in the COVID-19 pandemic and the labor market of the United States in the COVID-19 pandemic, where the unemployment rates in the continental European economies did not increase that much as compared to the United States. However, of course, it will also probably bounce back quicker in the United States and in continental economies. However, in between that, there are many people that are unemployed in the United States, and within Europe, you probably also see a north-south divide with many more informal jobs in southern countries that are also lost, that are not always there in the statistics. Next point, how secure or precarious is the life of these workers if they cannot work? This is, of course, also a question. If someone is sick, if someone loses their job, if someone is old enough that we say, okay, you don't have to work anymore, how secure is their income, their living, and so on and so on, and what factors does this depend on? Then we can also ask, is there any democracy in the workplace? So are workers in a position where they can also make decision in the company? So be it only the color of the factory walls, or be it more substantial decision when it comes to wages or production or whatever, and there's a whole spectrum of that. So is there any workplace democracy? And all these things are important to look at the situation, but then there's the one thing that I highlighted at the very bottom there, and this is the question, are they allowed to organize, and are they able to organize? And this is, you could argue, maybe the most important of these questions, because all the stuff that are listed there on top of it, it's probably not going to get any better if the latter condition is not fulfilled, because wages will only increase, labor market regulation will only take place, and so on, if those that are affected by it are able to organize. So the power and the right to unionize is something that is very, very important when it comes to working conditions. So these are all the things that we have to look at if we want to discuss, are we willing to say, well, capitalism is maybe not perfect, but it's something that we can agree it's working out okay for everyone, so we choose this and we don't have any better alternative? Or do we say, no, this is something that we cannot live with? if we want to make this decision, then all these things concerning the lives of those that are working are very important. Another thing that we have to look at if we look at labor is this whole idea of division of labor. The idea of division of labor is that not everyone does the same stuff, but everyone does specific stuff, and then the whole labor process that needs to be performed is done by different people in a divided kind of fashion. And at one extreme, you can say there are these kind of subsistence economies where every individual or every household at least will perform the same kind of tasks to make their own living. So everyone grows crops, everyone bakes bread, everyone sews their clothes, everyone fishes, everyone does the education of the children, and so on and so on. This is something that's done in every household, and all the households in the world, or in the country, do the same thing. And then from there you have this other extreme where maybe every single person only does one thing and does this time and again and again and again, over and over again, which is like this Taylorist utopia or dystopia, whether depends on how you look at it. And in between that, there are, of course, a lot of possibilities. And if we look at the effects of division of labor, there are different perspectives. And one of them is the liberal perspective, where we say, well, division of labor allows for specialization, making work more productive, and thereby increasing the wealth of nations. The wealth of nations, of course, is a title of Adam Smith's famous treatment on the economy, and one of the most famous parts of this treatment is treatise is his description of a pin factory, where the argument goes that the more divided the work process is into ever simpler, ever smaller steps, the more effective the work will become and the more pins will be produced. So at the end of this process, you have probably a worker that does the same just step of transforming some metal into some needles just over again a couple of thousand times per day. And so this is kind of like the production line type of work. And if everyone does that, they will be far more effective in producing needles than if one worker does one step of these always after another, because then they always have to run around between different workplaces, change their tools, and also they won't be as effective because they cannot get as used to just doing the same thing ever and ever and ever and ever again. So the idea is, the more we divide labor up, the more specialized people will become, the more effective they will become, the more they will be able to produce. And if we produce ever more, then we have ever more, we are ever more wealthy, which is a good thing. Then we also have different kind of critical perspectives on the division of labor. One can be roughly summed up as the critique of alienation, which is a concept that is defined in many different ways in the Marxist discourse. The general idea is that the kind of work that you do under these conditions is less pleasant than other kinds of work. So it's a difference if you think, well, I need a bread or I need a pin, and then you do all the stuff that you need to get a thing, and then you do it for you. This is like you cooking a nice, lovely meal in the evening because you think, well, now I'm done with work and now I just relax and cook this meal for myself, and then you enjoy this whole activity. If, however, you work in a factory where they produce like factory produced meal that you only have to put in the microwave afterwards, then similar steps have to be taken, yet you just like have to do the same hand movement all over again, and you don't do it before because you want to eat that meal afterwards. You do it because someone else will eat that meal at some distant point in the future, and because your boss at your job tells you to do exactly this step time and time and time over again. And so this is a different kind of work, and this is not pleasant. And also it comes with the structure of domination, because one thing that's very peculiar about Adam Smith's pin factory is that he looks at it from the perspective how much can the workers produce, but someone that doesn't really pop up in this description is the one who owns the factory. And then the question, of course, would be, well, do the people that work in the pin factory actually become wealthier by being a worker in this factory? Or is it only the one who owns the factory that will reap all this wealth that is produced? And I'm not saying that the latter sentence is the true one, but at least it's one question that you have to ask. So in general, it's what defines critical theories is that they always look at effects of domination, power, and exploitation. And so also if you look at the division of labor, you also have to look at the question what processes of domination, exploitation take place there. The next point is that you can more specifically look at unequal processes of division of labor. So not every process of producing stuff is as pleasant or as unpleasant as others are. So it might very well be that the division of labor means that some people do all the nice stuff while other people do all the not so nice stuff. So probably my job explaining international political economy to you is much more pleasant than many other jobs out there are. And I could say, well, it's just a division of labor. I do what I can do best, and you people do what you can do best. Yet, it's also true that I do this rather nice and interesting kind of job where it's something new every day, and I myself learn a lot of stuff, and yada yada yada, where someone else has to go to work 8 hours a day, or maybe if it's in the wrong country, 14 hours a day, and just do the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. And it would be quite lazy for me to just say, well, it's division of labor, everybody does what they can do best, because maybe I myself would be so bad at doing the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. And maybe someone who works in a Chinese factory may be as good as I am in explaining international political economy if they ever had the chance to, but we're not gonna find out easily. So looking at the division of labor is not something that you should look at from the lens of effectivity, but also at the lens from the lens of power and domination and exploitation. And if you look at people inside the university that work in the university, they will also discuss similar problems or questions. And typically there the question about the division of labor is some people have to do the teaching, some people have to do the administration, and some people have to do the research and writing part. And here typically the discourse says that the research and writing, this is like the sublime part of scholarship, and the administration and the teaching, they are just like some strenuous duties. So even in this academy, then there's once again a division of labor that's not equal either there. And there are also processes in which the teaching is increasingly done by few people who do a lot of teaching, and other people might have to do less teaching in exchange. And this is of course also a process of power and domination that's taking place there. However, I'm not going to complain about teaching right here. If we further look at the unequal division of labor, we can do this by deploying this idea of externalization and internalization. If we look at it in the international perspective, we can say that there's this tendency that positive factors are internalized, they are kept in the richer countries, and in the richer countries they are kept among the higher classes, and they are kept typically more among the male part of the population, and they're also typically kept among the whites or the ethnic majority, or it depends a little bit from country to country, but there's typically also an ethnic kind of division of labor, where it's typically that the native population gets the better jobs than the migrants, at least in the richer countries. In some of the poorer countries, it might be the other way around. On the other hand, negative factors are externalized to other countries, to women, to minorities, and so on and so on. So let's discuss a couple of dimensions of this externalization. So what's typically kept for the ones that have a more privileged position are what we might call good jobs. So a good job is a job where you are secure, where the things that you do are widely recognized as a valuable contribution to society, and so on and so on, and where you also probably not risk your life for. On the other hand, there are jobs that are just strenuous, unpleasant, maybe dangerous, that are dirty, and that are stigmatized by society. And so it's typically that the latter jobs are outsourced, they are handed outwards to other countries and downwards towards minorities and women and lower classes of society, and so on and so on. Then there's also the question, what does even count as work? And the jobs that are widely accepted as work, they are often kept for those who are better off, and other jobs that are not so easily thought about as work. I'm going to discuss more about this when I discuss gender, which is typically care work, caring for children and so on. They are also outsourced to others. When you think of caring of children, you can also think about this internalization, externalization another way, because in a sense there's also this tendency that many people in Western countries have or claim that they are also good parents because they spend good quality time with their children, and there's a whole discourse about this idea of quality time, which is an expression that didn't even exist a couple of years ago, but now this whole idea, okay, as good parents we want to spend quality time with our children and our family, and typically changing diapers and cleaning the bathroom and all these things, they don't count as quality time. However, they have to be done, and they are of course also part of what needs to be done for a family or human beings to exist. So these things are outsourced so that there's more time left for this pleasant quality time section of it. This is also something of internalization, externalization. It also goes for security and precariousness in different kind of ways, and you sometimes see this even in the very same factories, that there are some workers that have work contracts under collective bargaining where they have high job security and high wages, while other people working at the very same companies have much worse conditions. And these kinds of inequalities are typically always also gendered and racialized. So it has been so for the last, or basically since ever, that the more secure jobs are taken by majority white ethnic males, and the more precarious positions are taken by women and minorities. And so if there's an economic crisis, the ones that probably lose their jobs are the women and minorities rather than the male majority population. And this you can also see this if you look at the history of labor migration in Germany in the Federal Republic, when there were the so-called guest worker programs in the 1950s and 1960s, where these were the workers that had the worse paid, more precarious jobs, and this of course allowed white German workers to have the more secure jobs. The same goes for high pay and low pay, and you can also say the same thing about regulation and deregulation, which has quite a bit to do with the security and precariousness. So more regulated labor market and so on. And you can also see some part of this regulation, deregulation on an international scale, that that jobs are sent somewhere else where working conditions are more precarious, because then it's cheaper. Two more things here. So this distinction between real work and care work, which I'm going to discuss a little bit more in a minute. This is something sometimes also discussed under terms of production and reproduction. At least it was a couple of decades ago. These were the terms to go with. So the idea then was that in factories, stuff is produced, so that makes sure that we have enough food, that we have cars, that we have washing machines and all this stuff. And this is production work. And on the other hand, we have reproduction work, which is the work that we need to make sure that we still have a workforce. So which means having children, nurturing children, caring for the elderly, educating, and so on and so on. So there's this distinction between production and reproduction, and it's similar to the distinction between real work and care work, which was not always seen as real work. However, the care work is the term that's used to make it a little bit more specific and to overcome this distinction between production and mere reproduction. And then you can also, of course, say that this whole externalization does not always work, or maybe it is self-defeating, because if insecure jobs and so on are externalized to other countries, that also means that might first of all mean that the overall situation in the country that keeps the better jobs becomes better for most people. However, afterwards they are in the competition, and the workers in one country are in the competition with the workers in another country, and this might create pressure to deregulate in the higher income countries as well. And this is a dynamic that you see over the last couple of decades, and I already discussed this when addressing globalization. Next is the question, how could things become better? And this is something I put here because this is something that students typically ask when we discuss this. Because when we discuss the International Division of Labor and we discuss how bad the working conditions for many people are that produce the stuff that we consume, then this typically comes with a moral appeal that we should do something about it. And when we discuss this, then what students oftentimes think of first is such a thing as moral consumption. So maybe consume less stuff, maybe consume stuff that is fair trade, or maybe give something to charity and these kind of things. And I don't have anything against these things. So if you have money that you can share, give it to charity. If you have money to pay for fair trade coffee instead of regular coffee, go ahead. Don't let me hold you back. Or a more fairly produced phone instead of your not so fairly produced phone. I'm not saying anything against this. I'm not keeping you back. What I want to say is that if you focus on these kind of questions, then you have a very, very limited focus on how things could become better, and you probably are unable to see the parts that really count. Because in the end, what you need is a better structural framework that makes sure that the conditions are better for those who do the strenuous work, and the conditions are better for everyone. And this does not happen when those that are better off just charitably give money to those who are worse off. There's nothing to say against this, but this is not going to change the situation, because then those that are worse off are still dependent on the graciousness of those that are better off. So as a general rule of thumb, you can always say that nothing ever gets better without social movements by those whose situation is to be bettered. So there is this general narrative that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves, and it's not entirely wrong. However, without slaves fighting back, without slave resistance among slaves in the United States, without a social movement of abolitionists that supported this resistance, probably Abraham Lincoln wouldn't even had the idea of taking this political venture. Similarly, you can say a lot of things about progress in legislation for women and so on and so on. Nothing of this would have happened without the women's movement. And all the things that make the lives of workers in Europe much better than they were in the 19th century, and much better than the conditions of workers in many other countries. This of course only happened because there was legislation to make sure that it happened, but nothing of it would have happened if it were not for a workers' movement that fought for these things. That of course does not mean that those who are better off are free from any responsibility or obligation here, because any of these social movements have much better chances if the others in society act in solidarity. So this at least means that you don't fight the movements of those that try to better their situation, but also that you ask how can you support them. And once again, support for a political struggle is not the same thing as giving to charity. It's a different way to think about it. It's also a different thing to do. So it's not about giving money to feed the poorest, but it's rather to help political organization among the poorest who want to better their situation. It is complicated if you think about it longer, but as a general first perspective, it's not a question of paternalism and graciousness, but of solidarity, and this is a different thing. Finally, however, if you only look at social movements and solidarity, you might also miss a different part, because if we look at the abolition of slavery, if we look at women's rights, if we look at the welfare state and workers' rights, nothing of this would have happened in the form that it has happened were it not for state institutions to institutionalize this change. So writing an amendment to the constitution that slavery is outlawed, writing a constitution, institutionalizing the welfare state, and so on, and creating laws for gender equality. This is important, and at least as long as we live in capitalism and live in states, there won't be meaningful change without that. However, you should not say this is important and the social movements are not important, because this kind of legislation typically never happens without a social movement pushing for it. Okay, next we'll discuss the gendered nature of the division of labor and the women's movement a little bit more. I'm not going to go into this quite deep. So just first, 3 general remarks on gender in IPE. I said this about colonialism, I say this about gender once again. Not everything in international political economy can be explained with, or let alone reduced to, gender. However, if one is not ignorant to question of gender, one finds it to be relevant in every single aspect of IPE. So for example, if we think of the last session on international finance, then we can see, surprisingly or not, that almost all important positions in financial market firms are taken by men, and this happens to an extent that cannot be explained away by coincidence. And of course, all the effects of a financial market crisis also affect different genders differently. Then I already mentioned that different lines of work are gendered, so different genders are in different positions, and typically it's women that are in the worst position. So we find gender everywhere if we look for it. And now I typically assume that students ask, or this my experience tells me that students then ask, well, why do we need a feminist or a gender-focused IPE? If it's just everywhere, then we can just think about it as well. And I would say, yeah, possibly in a better world there would be no real need for a feminist IPE or a gender-focused IPE. However, if it were not for feminist scholars in IPE, most of IPE would be ignorant towards gender. So it needs this kind of pressure from specific scholars that push for looking at this, because otherwise the guys would probably always forget about it ever and ever again. And if we take into account gender perspective, we can once more look at this graphic that I showed you before. And if we look at this, then we find that gender is specifically important in many aspects here. So first, when you see the arrow with labor there, once again, the question always has to be what counts as work, what counts as labor. And we see this changing over the course of time, and we also see this differently in different countries. And today we would typically say, I guess, I hope, that taking care of children counts as work, and there are many people that are employed in preschool, kindergarten kind of work, and this is something that is routinely done as wage labor these days. However, this was not always the case. It was quite a long time in Western capitalist societies that women were simply expected to do this kind of work silently at home in the family, and it wasn't even thought of as work. It was just something that was thought of as stuff that women do, and so it was invisible and was not seen. And these are differences that can take different forms, and now you might think, well, if it gets into the market relations and if it gets paid, then things get better. However, this is not necessarily the case, or you don't have to see it that way necessarily in every field. So, for example, there are also processes of marketization that have problems. I'm going to discuss the international care chains in a minute. First, you can also think about such a thing as surrogate mothership. So the idea is that a woman can, or a couple can, for medical reasons, not have children of their own. However, they would like to have children. This might be because medical issues of the woman question, might also be because both parents are male or whatever, but maybe there's a couple or a single person that wants to have children, cannot have children. One model, of course, is simply adopting children, but there's also another model where they would pay another woman to carry their child. And it works differently for different couples that I mentioned, but this idea happens. So this is, of course, a marketization of something that would traditionally not be in the market. However, I wouldn't argue, and many feminists don't argue, that this is some kind of emancipation there because women finally get paid for the work. You can argue quite contrarily that this makes use of relationships of dependence, and this makes the body of the woman that sells her womb or her motherhood and then the child to others as an object of the market that you might not want for ethical reasons. And so there we have that certain activities that can, in this case, only be performed by women that were not seen as work before are then kind of becoming to be seen as work, but you wouldn't necessarily call this emancipation. There are some that would, but others wouldn't. And you probably also heard this in the news in the last month or so, because in Europe, one of the countries where this happens is the Ukraine, because I think in all European countries it would be illegal to have surrogate mothership. However, in Ukraine it is possible to do that, so that many might be that want to be parents from European Union countries or richer European Union countries pay women in Ukraine to be a surrogate mother. And now, because of COVID-19, they couldn't get their children there, so we had those rooms with many newborn babies that couldn't be collected due to the pandemic by their would-be parents, and this of course is a very strenuous situation for all the involved parties there. So the general idea here is the idea of what counts as work changed, the idea of what counts as paid work also changes, and this is economically relevant. These are economic questions, and what's more emancipated or more progressive here is not so easily decided always. Next question, of course, is, I already mentioned this, who performs the work that is necessary for the reproduction of the labor force, and how is this work performed, and under which conditions is it performed? So can the women be expected to, or is this even performed by women? First of all, under what conditions do women have to do this? Do they do this for their own children? Do they do this because their husband tells them to? What happens when they divorce from their husband? Do they have any social security or not? Or is this performed by other women that are not the parents of these children? Or when we talk about elder care, does this happen by the family members? And traditionally it also, and still it typically happens by the daughters, not by the sons of the elderly. Or is it performed by others, which are typically, once again, women workers, and then quite often migrant women workers, and under what conditions is this done? So these are questions that are not by nature questions that are gendered, but in reality they are gendered questions. And if it were not for feminist scholars of the economy and of IPE, these questions would hardly ever have been asked, but now they can be asked. Last point in the section is just some points of concept and developments in IPE, just as examples that relate to gender. First, we have this idea of gender mainstreaming, which is named in the textbook, which is why I pick it up here. And I also pick it up because not only in the German debate, but particularly there are grave misconceptions of the idea of gender mainstreaming. Sometimes it sounds like it's something very, very radical. Sometimes it sounds like it's about taking the penises away from someone, and it is not. So the idea of gender mainstreaming, which was formulated and institutionalized in the World Women Conference in Beijing in 1995, is simply that the reorganization, improvement, development, and evaluation of policy processes take place in a form that a gender equality perspective is incorporated in all policies at all levels and at all stages by the actors normally involved in policymaking. What this means is basically that we stop doing policy thinking that everyone is male, then wait for feminists to complain, then say, well, this is not about gender, then they complain more, and then we say, well, maybe it's a little bit about gender, but we don't really have anything that we can change here. Then feminists complain even more, and then finally legislator will say, okay, we change this a little bit to account for gender problems. The idea is rather that whatever kind of problem you look at it, you also have in mind that there is a gender perspective to it, that there are gender aspects to it, and you think about these right away, and you think about the effects that it has on gender equality right away whenever you write a law, whenever you talk about a law, whenever you do anything in public policy, basically. And so you see, this is not some radical idea, but something that you might think of as commonsensical. However, it took some time till people got this idea that this is something that you could do. The next point, quite briefly, I chose this because it also relates to labor and gender, and this is the globalization of care work. I already mentioned this. There is a general tendency that care work is more and more outsourced to female migrant workers. So the care work for children, for the elderly, for the sick in countries such as Germany is to an ever shrinking degree or share performed by ethnic German women, and instead outsourced to others. And this can to some degree be celebrated as a process of emancipation, because now these German women who are liberated from their care work, which I only say their care work in citation mark because it would of course as much be the care work of German men, but they haven't been doing it right away. This care work is not now simply distributed equally between the genders, rather it's outsourced to others. The women are now able to enter the workforce, maybe have a better chance to gain an equal income to the men in the society, which you can say, well, this is a good thing. However, the care work is still performed by women, and now it's no longer performed by the women whose children and parents we are talking about, but by women from other countries. In Germany, this might be Poland, Romania, Ukraine, typically nations in Central and Eastern Europe that have a lower income than Germany has. And these, of course, also have families, children, parents. And now they come to Germany to care for elderly and young and cleaning the household and all the other things that fall under care work here. And this, of course, means that they are not in their country with their family all the time. Yet they might say, well, for me, this is the better deal because for 2 weeks being in Germany doing this work, I make more money than if I worked 4 weeks or 8 weeks in Romania. So it might be the better deal for them. It might be the better deal for the Germans. It might also be the better deal for the children of the migrant workers, because maybe they have higher food security now, and maybe they also can afford a better education now. So from a liberal perspective, you can once again say, well, everyone's a winner right here because the market forces now work. Yet I think it's very difficult to see this as something that's not a process of grave inequality and domination and exploitation. If some people have to travel these distances so often, have to be away from their families so often, only to care for others in other countries and not be there with their people, not be at home. So it's a relation of domination and it's marketization. So we have these processes and we have them all over the world. And this is not just like some small niche market that feminists like to talk about, but that's economically irrelevant. If you look at countries such as the Philippines, then the money that these women earn and send back or bring back to their countries, that's a relevant share of the GDP. So that's economically important, and it's also economically important for the countries where the care work is performed, because this is work that has to be done and it liberates part of the workforce to do other jobs there. So this is an important economic relation there, and it's an unequal relation. And similar to that, you can find many more examples of concepts and developments in IPE that are relevant. You can talk about sex work, you can talk about developments in poverty, how they are gendered, and so on and so on. I'm not going to go into this. This is all described quite well in the textbook, so look there. Next point is to give one example of dynamics in international division of labor. Probably you would not have heard of the company Foxconn if it were not for political controversies over the last couple of years. Now you might have heard of them, and most likely all of us have used products of them, but we never used a product where it was written on them, this is created by Foxconn. So Foxconn is one of the largest producers and employers in electronics in the world. So they have, I think, roughly 800,000 employees, and they produce cell phones, they produce tablets, they produce notebook computers, and they produce other parts for electronic devices. And most famously, they also produce many Apple products. And so a couple of years ago, there was a scandal around Apple and around Foxconn. And the reason for the scandal was mainly that there was a wave of workers at Foxconn factories in China. So Foxconn is a company that's from Taiwan, but the main production facilities are in mainland China. They also have some in Europe, some in other parts of the world, but mainly in mainland China. So their business model generally is they don't develop products that they then market as Foxconn products. Rather, say they offer their services or their production capacities to other companies. So for example, Apple develops a new iPhone, then they have the technical specifications, they get the parts from different companies all over the world. All these parts are shipped to China then, where Foxconn workers assemble these parts. And they do that under conditions under which no worker in the United States or in Northern Western Europe would ever work typically. So there was a big scandal about this, and then Foxconn was thought to be one of the bad companies that exploit their workers. And that is kind of true, because they push their workers, they push them to work beyond the legal framework given by the Chinese state, because even working under Chinese law would probably not be effective enough. So they try to increase their effectivity by forcing the workers to work unpaid overtime. And it's true that this is a problem, and it's true that Foxconn is responsible. However, what you also have to look at there is who makes what kind of profit there. And I only right now found these two cake diagrams here, or pie diagrams, which are 10 years old, but it probably hasn't changed that much. So what you see here is the distribution of value for an iPhone or an iPad. So you can think of it, if you buy an iPhone and you pay, let's say, 1,000 euros for that in the store where you buy it, and then of course there are some taxes which are not here in the value thing because they are added to this. Then you say, okay, the value is 1,000 euros, and here you can see who gets what share of these 1,000 euros. And there you see that the majority of it is the profit for Apple, which is roughly then almost 600 euros. It probably declined a little bit, but not that much. And then you see there are other others who get part of the money. So another big part is like the raw materials that it's created from. And then there are also other companies that make profits. And then you look at what amount of money stays with Foxconn and stays with China, and you see that it's almost nothing. So if you look for the iPhone, then the labor in China costs 1.8%. So if you buy an iPhone for 1,000 euros, then it would be 18 of these euros that remain with workers in China. And then if you look at the money that Foxconn makes from it, then you see it would be 5 euros So it's not that Foxconn has a very high profit rate, and this is so because Foxconn also has to act in competition to other companies that would be willing to do the same thing for Apple and would also produce iPhones for Apple. So they negotiate with Apple, and Apple says, well, if you don't do it for that amount of money, we find someone else who will do it. And so it's very difficult to put all the blame on Foxconn because their whole business is not that profitable, and it only works because they put all this pressure on the workers. Is the pressure they get from Apple and from other customers, they pass it on to the workers, which is not say that they are not morally responsible for it. However, it would be too easy to blame them. And then you can, of course, blame Apple, but don't blame Apple and then buy Samsung or Huawei or whoever, because none of these others are better. And also not the other companies that will offer the same services are better than Foxconn. So it's basically very much the same thing for whatever product you buy. It's only that typically the profit rates of Apple are mostly higher than that of others because they also benefit from their name, so they can afford to have these higher profit rates there. But other than that, it's typically the same, and it's not per se more ethically to have any kind of Android phone than it is to have an Apple phone. And the question now, of course, is who can do what there? Of course, Apple could just say, well, we don't push you as hard, Foxconn. Here we double the amount of money that we pay for you, and if you add up the profits of Foxconn, which is 0.5%, and the cost of labor in China is 1.8%, which would together be 2.3%. So Apple would just really give up a small part of their margin of profit to Foxconn for them to double the Foxconn profits and double the wage of the workers. However, why would they do that if they don't have to? So you cannot rely on Apple to be nice here, and it would be wrong to expect them to be nice here. And so the question always is, who can put what pressure on whom for things to get better? And then once again, we can talk about unions in China, which is very difficult because the official unions in China are controlled by the Chinese state, which has a great interest in foreign business being profitable there. So it's not really independent union work. And it's also very difficult to blame Apple because the others are not better. We cannot legislate this way easily in Germany or the United States or whatever. So it is a problem, but you have to think about it in an international frame. One of the attempts to attack these kind of problems is what's known as the decent work agenda by the International Labour Organization. I already mentioned the ILO a couple of weeks ago when I discussed global governance and international organizations, and they exist for more than 100 years right now, but they only came up with the decent work agenda in 1999, so a little bit more than 20 years ago. And this is not because they didn't want decent work before that. However, their perception of the problem changed because they saw that some old assumptions did not really come true. So the old assumption for much of the middle of the 20th century was that we witness a progressing formalization and bureaucratization of capitalism, which means that money or finance is more and more formalized and bureaucratized, work is more and more formalized, and politics is more and more formalized. So processes of work happen under state regulation and legal regulation to an ever-raising degree, because we have more stronger unions, we have more collective bargaining, we have stronger welfare states, and all this. And if we look at Western Europe and the United States for much of the 20th century, this is kind of what we see. However, since 1970s, we see different processes. We talked about this a few times in lectures. So we see neoliberalization or disembedding of capitalism, which you can also say is an informalization. If we look at an informalization of work, then we see that work becomes more and more precarious and less regulated. And also we see these processes of externalization where under circumstances of globalization, certain jobs are then offshored and outsourced to other countries, which changes the whole dynamic under which work can be regulated. And this then raises social inequality and social insecurity. And so what the ILO said we want instead of all these developments is we want decent work, which in Germany is often translated as gute Arbeit, which has this little bit different of a moral twist on it, but let's say decent work. It's not exactly good work, but it's work that you can live on. And the actors in the ILO wanted this as some discursive political counter project where they said, well, if we want a world that's worth living, that's worth keeping, then what we need is decent work. And this is of course a project that aims at having an alternative narrative and an alternative measure to only looking at GDP growth or these kind of things where you say, well, if there's growth in this country, then everyone gets richer, which is not always true, because sometimes growth can mean that a few get much richer and the rest have even worse living conditions. So what they rather say, well, we need decent working conditions. And what's the content of this decent work agenda? You can distinguish elements, instruments, and the networks of cooperation. First, the elements or the four pillars of this agenda are as follows. First, we have the idea that there should be job creation, or to put it from the perspective of the workers, there should be productive and freely chosen employment. And this, of course, means, and this is something that's not self-evident if you look at it globally, that there should not be forced work or slave work, because there are many people in the world that cannot choose their job because they are under some form of debt slavery or something like that. That should not be there. And neither should there be child work, but there should only be people that choose their job freely from certain alternatives. And this, of course, means that there must be enough jobs. Secondly, the idea is that there should be rights at work, so there should be a minimum standard of secure working conditions. There should be minimum wage and labor standards. Third, there should be some form of social protection so that if you lose your job, you don't lose your living. Next, there should be social dialogue, which means that for decision within the companies, the workforce also has a say in this, and they are allowed to organize collectively and make their voices heard. So this is the goal. And as you see, these goals are not like an ideal world kind of thing, but something that's rather defined as a minimum standard that you want for people to have some kind of decent living conditions as people who are wage dependent. Then when it comes to the instrument, then it becomes a little bit more tricky, because they see that it's not that strong and there are not that much internationally binding instruments to it. So in general, there's this idea that we want a normative discourse, that we want decent work as an idea that's there, that people have in mind when they talk about development in countries, that they don't only talk of GDP growth or something like that, but also of decent work. and that we have also these normative discourses that can take the form of scandalization. So if there is a suicide wave at a factory that produces products that are very profitable in rich countries, then of course you try to create a campaign where you say, well, this is bad, this should not happen, look at what has to happen for your iPhones to be produced. And these kind of campaigns are not that new. We already had them with Nike, for example, which is not worse in working conditions than other producers of shoes or textiles. However, if there is a brand which has a high reputation and that is profitable, then there's the strategy among activists to single out this brand, not necessarily to harm them and help other brands, but rather to set an example, because then the politics will work better, and this is then hoped to put pressure on the whole industry. Then the next step is that core labor standards should be defined and for example by the International Labour Organization, and then define the standards that work should meet all over the world. And then another step should be that there should be reports and public databases from all the countries in the world with the involvement of unions and employers and business organizations, so that we have surveillance data to see where the problems in decent work are and where they are not. And as you probably might think right now, all of these are good things, but will this lead to a world where everyone has the conditions of decent work? Probably not. Will it help? Probably a little bit. So for it to help, finally we also need the networks of cooperation. So more generally, we have the three general parties. We have the governments or the states, we have the trade unions, and we have the business associations or employer associations. Then we have other civil society NGOs. These are the parties that we always want to include there. And of course, these are parties that have quite different interests. However, if you get all them in, you have better chances at incremental progress at least. And then of course there are like the big organizations that you also want to be paying attention to questions of decent work. So by definition responsible is the ILO, but then you also have the United Nations, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, and the European Union. And all these are hoped to think of decent work. And now you might argue, is this any better than buying fair trade coffee? I would say yes. Is it as good as legally binding laws all over the world? Probably not, but in contrast to globally binding laws, it's something that's possible right now. So, and something that you don't see here, but something that's also there, and this is the opportunity to close the session. In 2008, there was another campaign built on this campaign. This is the Decent Work and Decent Life for Women campaign. So you see that there's this attempt to emphasize the question of gender here. However, in all fairness, we must say to the ILO that the question of gender was already present in the 1999 Decent Work Agenda. It was not only explicitly always mentioned that there should be decent work for men and women. There was also an extra section on it discussing the relevance of gender equality. So it was already to some degree gender mainstreamed, the Decent Work Agenda, which does not mean that it is not necessary to make an additional push for gender issues here. Okay, this was my attempt at being concise and short. I once again failed, but I'll try better next time. See you.